On the 18th of August 1965, a Marine rifle company flew by helicopter into a landing zone on the coast of South Vietnam that had been chosen off an aerial photograph as a clear patch of open ground. What the photograph did not reveal was that the zone sat almost directly on top of the command position of a Viet Cong battalion that had spent weeks digging in and waiting. The first helicopters touched down without a shot. As the rest came in, the tree lines on the flanks opened with mortars and machine guns, and within the hour that company was pinned in the open, taking fire from 3 directions, while a mile away a lost supply column of amphibious tractors and flame tanks blundered onto the wrong trail and radioed that it was about to be overrun. This was meant to be the clean one, the first time American ground forces would attack in regimental strength in the Vietnam War, planned in barely 48 hours around the word of a single teenage defector. For its first several hours, very little of it went the way the plan said it would. The operation was called Starlight, and when it ended 6 days later, the Marines counted 614 dead Viet Cong against 45 of their own killed. That figure would be quoted for decades as proof of what American firepower could accomplish once it was finally turned loose. It also concealed most of the story, including the fact that 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor, and a single rifle company would emerge from one day of fighting with a collection of decorations rare in the history of the Corps. Responsibility for I Corps rested with the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, commanded from June 1965 by Major General Louis Walt. Walt was a formidable and highly decorated officer whose career reached back to Guadalcanal and the Chosin Reservoir. He had won 2 Navy Crosses in the Second World War, and one of his battalion commanders in Korea had been a colonel named Oscar Petros, who would surface again in this story. Walt understood that Chu Lai's value made it a magnet, and he understood that under the standing rules the most he could do was wait and absorb the first punch. Whether he would be permitted to strike before it landed was, for a time, an open question. On the 30th of July, the overall American commander in Vietnam, General William Westmoreland, told Walt that he expected the Marines to run larger offensive operations at greater distances from their bases. Walt reminded him that a letter of instruction from the 6th of May confined the Marines to reserve and reaction missions in support of South Vietnamese units already heavily engaged. Westmoreland answered that these restraints were no longer realistic, that Walt should rewrite the instructions himself and build in whatever authority he thought he needed, and that he would approve the revisions. On the 6th of August, Walt received official permission to undertake large offensives against the enemy. A week later, the arrival of the headquarters of the 7th Marine Regiment gave him the infantry to act. What he needed now was a target worth the risk. The target had been advertising itself for months, and it was not a band of part-time guerrillas. The 1st Viet Cong Regiment was a veteran main force unit, well led and well supplied, with officers who had fought the French. Late in May and again in early July, it had struck the same South Vietnamese battalion at the hamlet of Ba Gia, 20 miles south of Chu Lai, and virtually annihilated it, reducing a force of 257 men to 40, capturing 2 105mm howitzers and killing several American advisors. The regiment was so pleased with these victories that it took to calling itself the Ba Gia Regiment. Having taken losses of its own, it began moving north toward Chu Lai in early August to rest, refit, and gather recruits and American intelligence. Sifting through what General Walt's intelligence officer called countless low-level reports, gradually concluded that the regiment was on the move somewhere in the coastal lowlands. The break came on the 15th of August, and it came from a 17-year-old. A conscript named Vo Thao, assigned to one of the regiment's battalions, had asked for leave to visit his family, been refused, forged papers, and deserted. Brought to the headquarters of the South Vietnamese commander of 1st Corps, Major General Nguyen Chang Thi, the young man was personally questioned by the general, and stated that the 1st Viet Cong Regiment was on the Van Tuong Peninsula, about 12 miles south of Chu Lai, and preparing to attack the Marine base. Thi considered it the most important and reliable intelligence he had received during the entire war and relayed it to Walt at once. That same day, signals intelligence confirmed the regiment's location on the peninsula, and Walt would later describe the signals report as a clinching factor in the decision to launch the operation. There was a wrinkle in the intelligence worth naming, because the gap between what the Americans believed and what was actually true shaped everything that followed. From the defectors' account, Marine planners concluded that roughly 2,000 men were on the peninsula, 2 full battalions plus the regimental command post and supporting elements. In reality, the force there numbered closer to 1,500, and the regimental command post and the rest of the unit lay some 15 kilometers farther south, its senior officers away at a planning meeting in the hills to the west. Contrary to American assumptions, the regiment had no immediate plans to attack Chu Lai. It was recuperating and training. The Americans were about to launch a preemptive strike against an enemy who was not, at that moment, preparing to strike them. General Walt flew to Chu Lai on the 16th for a hurried planning conference with his senior commanders. When one general suggested first sending a reconnaissance battalion through the area to see what was there, the response, as he later summarized it, was that the Marines had to surprise the enemy and overwhelm him, and that was how it would be done. The operation would combine the Marines' heliborne and amphibious capabilities with fire support from air, artillery, and naval guns, all built around speed, secrecy, and surprise. Walt and his officers envisioned a hammer and anvil. One company would seal off escape to the north as a blocking force. One battalion would land across the beach south of the Van Tuong village complex in a conventional amphibious assault. A second would land by helicopter to the west in 3 landing zones designated red, white, and blue. The 2 battalions would then drive the enemy east and northeast into the sea, where the water at his back and Marine forces on his flanks would leave him nowhere to run. The operation nearly went to battle under a different name. It was originally to be called Satellite, but a power blackout forced a staff clerk to work by candlelight, and in the dim light the clerk typed Starlight instead. The error stuck. Command of the assault force, designated Regimental Landing Team 7, fell to Colonel Oscar F. Petros, the newly arrived commander of the 7th Marines, a soft-spoken North Carolinian whose gentle drawl belied a combat record that included the Macon Island raid, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima. Petros had a problem the plan could not immediately solve, which was that his own battalions were scattered across the Pacific. One sat at Queenon and had not been under his control for months. Another was afloat with the 7th Fleet's Special Landing Force, 720 miles away at Subic Bay in the Philippines. A third had only just made an administrative landing at Chu Lai and was still married up to none of its equipment. Early in the planning meeting, Walt turned to him and said, "Pete, you're the only one available." To assemble a force, the division assigned Petros 2 battalions drawn from other regiments, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Muir's 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fisher's 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines. When Petros asked for the floating battalion as well, the 3-7 Marines, Walt secured its release from the Pacific commander within hours. Its transit time from Subic Bay set the timing of the whole operation and fixed D-Day as the 18th of August. Petros considered himself fortunate in his battalion commanders. Muir was a former enlisted Marine, soft-spoken and hard-driving, so often at the front that his staff worried about him. Fisher, known as Bull, was a heavy-set veteran who had earned a Navy Cross in the breakout from the Chosin Reservoir. The 3 men knew one another well, which mattered, because there was almost no time to plan. As Petros put it, the planning was so hasty that there was no time to bring up problems. Secrecy was treated as paramount, and here the operation revealed something about the state of the alliance. At General Thie's own insistence, the South Vietnamese Joint General Staff were told nothing until after the battle began, and only Thie and one other senior South Vietnamese general were informed in advance, chiefly so they could keep their own forces clear of the target area. Even most of the Marines who would fight were told nothing of the larger mission until it was underway. The ground itself would prove the planners' most consequential blind spot, though they could not have known it. On a map, the Van Tuong area was open coastal farmland. On foot it was a patchwork of rice paddies, hedgerows 6 to 8 feet high, bamboo thickets, and scattered hamlets, laced with trails and cut by dikes that channeled every movement and smothered every field of fire. The hamlets were not clusters of huts but fortified positions, honeycombed with fighting holes, camouflaged trench lines, interlocking tunnels and caves, with some houses rigged so their walls could be dropped to expose machine guns firing along pre-planned lanes. Marines of the 3-3 Marines had patrolled this ground for weeks, and their company commander, Captain Calvin Morris, remembered the pattern plainly, that every time they went in, they got hit, and got hit, and got hit again. The defenders could fire, slip back through concealed passages, and reappear behind the men who had just cleared them. And that, more than any head count, would define the fighting. The operation opened quietly the night before. On the 17th of August, Company M of the 3-3 Marines landed near the mouth of a river and marched south to establish a blocking position at the northern edge of the objective area, sealing the back door. When one of its men was wounded by a booby trap, Captain Morris ordered him carried rather than evacuated by helicopter, so that a medevac would not tip off the enemy that a large operation was underway. That evening, the assault force and Colonel Petros embarked on amphibious shipping, sailed east to deceive any watchers in coastal boats, then turned back and arrived off the beach in the dark before dawn. 2 destroyers and a cruiser took station to cover the landing. At 6:15, the preparation fires began, artillery pounding the helicopter landing zones and jets dropping 18 tons of bombs and napalm. The beach itself, designated Green Beach, received only light strafing, because the hamlet of An Kuyong sat too close to risk anything heavier landing among the assault troops. At 6:30, the lead companies of the 3-3 Marines came across Green Beach in tractors and pushed inland. 15 minutes later, the helicopter companies of the 2-4 Marines began landing at the western zones, and for a brief window the operation held. Company G came in against no resistance at all. At another zone, a mortar battery caught roughly 100 of the enemy in the open and killed an estimated 90 of them, exactly the kind of result the plan had imagined. The enemy exposed and destroyed at a distance by supporting arms. The fighting on the beach quickly demonstrated a different reality. On the right flank, Company K ran into heavy automatic weapons fire from a trench line, and 2 platoons were pinned down until First Lieutenant Amos Burt Hinson led a single squad in a charge that drove the enemy off the crest, firing his pistol as he went, an action for which he received the Silver Star. On the left, Company I moved inland toward the fortified hamlet of An Quong, where one of the operation's fiercest small unit fights developed. Here, Corporal Robert E. V. O'Malley, leading a squad, raced across an open rice paddy to a trench line, jumped in, and killed 8 of the enemy at close range with rifle and grenades, then led his squad to the aid of a neighboring unit under heavy fire. Wounded 3 times over the course of the day, he refused evacuation until his men were pulled to safety and was the last of his squad to leave the field. Nearby, the company commander, Captain Bruce Webb, was killed when a Viet Cong soldier feigning death threw a grenade into his command group. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Richard Purnell, took command of a decimated company and pushed it through the hamlet. The hardest lesson of the day developed inland, at the southernmost landing zone, where the plan came apart in a way that revealed how completely the intelligence had failed to locate the enemy's strength. Company H of the 2-4 Marines had landed almost on top of the 60th Viet Cong Battalion, the heart of the enemy position, though its commander, First Lieutenant Homer Jenkins, did not yet know it. The enemy allowed the first helicopters to land undisturbed, then poured fire into the succeeding waves. An Army gunship pilot, Major Donald Radcliffe, was killed covering the landing. Jenkins pushed toward the adjacent hamlet and a nearby hill, and both attacks bogged down against bunkers, trenches, and machine guns. In the fight for the hill, a machine gunner named Lance Corporal Ernie Wallace advanced firing from the hip and was credited with killing an estimated 25 of the enemy, part of a day's work that would eventually total more than 40 and earn him the Navy Cross. What followed for Company H was a day-long ordeal in the open. Believing the hamlets ahead had been cleared, Jenkins led his men into paddies between the villages, where the enemy caught them in a crossfire from nearly every direction, and the tracked vehicles bogged in the muck. In this fight, Lance Corporal Joe the 100th, Paul, a 19-year-old fireteam leader, saw wounded Marines stranded between his platoon and the enemy, and a machine gun pouring fire into them. He dashed across the fire-swept paddy, placed himself between the wounded and the enemy, and poured his own fire into the Viet Cong to divert them. Wounded several times, he refused to withdraw until the casualties were pulled to safety, and he collapsed over his weapon before he could be evacuated. He died of his wounds the next day. By late afternoon, Company H had been reduced to 24 of its own infantrymen, dug in at its landing zone, having achieved none of its objectives, but having struck the enemy hard in the center of his own position. While Company H fought for survival, the operation produced the episode that would embarrass the command for weeks afterward. By midday, the units near the southern zone were low on water and ammunition, and a supply column of 5 amphibious tractors and 3 flame tanks, designated Column 21, was dispatched to reach Company 1. Somewhere between 2 hamlets, the column took the wrong trail and drove into an ambush. Explosions tore into the vehicles, recoilless rifle and mortar fire raked them, and within minutes the column commander was dead, and the survivors were fighting for their lives. One tank's flame weapon had already been knocked out. Marines climbed atop the abandoned vehicles and were shot down, and the enemy charged in 3-man cells that were cut apart one after another. The next day, more than 60 enemy bodies would be found around the column. Among the defenders, Sergeant James Malloy left the relative shelter of his tractor, took up a position in the open rice paddy, and conducted what his Navy Cross citation would call a virtual one-man defense for 20 hours, driving back repeated attempts to overrun the vehicles and refusing relief until the wounded were evacuated the following morning. Of the roughly 30 Marines with the column, 5 were killed and most of the rest wounded, but they held. The attempts to reach the column produced fresh disasters, as relief forces ran into the same prepared ground and were themselves ambushed and pinned. Colonel Petros committed a company of his reserve, and Company 1 was diverted back south to search for the column. But through the afternoon and into the night, no one could locate it precisely, in part because its frightened radio operator kept his transmitting key depressed, making it nearly impossible for the command post to break in and learn the column's position. As darkness fell, Petros halted his other units short, rather than let his lines overextend into the confused killing ground, and the Marines called for continuous naval illumination through the night. The bulk of the 60th Viet Cong Battalion, having taken severe losses, used that darkness to break contact and slip away, exactly the outcome the blocking positions had been drawn up to prevent. The clearest measure of the first day is a single rifle company. Of the roughly 177 men of Company 1 who had crossed the beach that morning, 14 were dead, including their commander, and more than 50 were wounded, and yet the company claimed 125 of the enemy killed in return. That company captured the operation in miniature. American firepower and mobility could inflict enormous losses, and did. The enemy's prepared ground and tactical skill could still exact a brutal toll on individual American units caught in the wrong terrain, and did. Both were true at the same moment, and the tidy final ratio would bury how sharp the fighting had been. The second day was a different battle, because the enemy who had made the first one so costly was largely gone. When the Marines attacked at dawn on the 19th into the ground that had seen the worst of the fighting, they found it abandoned, reached the lost supply column at last, and pulled it out. Pockets of resistance remained, and clearing them taught the final tactical lesson, as Marines swept through positions only to take fire from behind them, from men who had let them pass and reoccupied trenches and tunnels in their rear. The work now was digging defenders out one hole at a time and collapsing the tunnels on them. By nightfall, organized resistance had ended, but General Walt kept the operation running 5 more days so the area could be searched systematically, bringing in fresh Marine and South Vietnamese units. Starlight formally concluded at midnight on the 24th of August. The valor that had been spent across those days produced an accounting of its own, and nowhere more concentrated than in Company H of the 2-4 Marines. In a single day of battle, that one rifle company earned 1 Medal of Honor, 2 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, and a Bronze Star. a distinction rare in the history of the Marine Corps. The Medal of Honor went to Lance Corporal Joe Paul, the second man of Operation Starlight to receive the nation's highest award for valor. As a comrade wrote afterward in his official statement, Paul had risked his life to save others, and died so that his fellow Marines could be saved. The first Marine to be recognized was Corporal Robert O'Malley, whose one-man assault on the trench line and refusal to leave the field until his squad was safe made him the first Marine of the entire Vietnam War to receive the Medal of Honor, decorated by President Johnson at the White House the following year. Lieutenant Colonel Muir received the Navy Cross for his leadership, an award made posthumous when he was killed weeks later by a booby-trapped artillery shell, the first American battalion commander to die in Vietnam. Sergeant Molloy and Lance Corporal Wallace received Navy Crosses of their own, and a string of silver stars went to men like Purnell, Hinson, and the two Marines who fought beside O'Malley in the trench. That so many of the war's early decorations for valor came out of a single battle, often out of a single desperate company, is a reminder that the body count so often used to summarize Starlight was assembled one perimeter at a time. When the tallies were reconciled, they produced the figures that would define the operation in American memory, and they deserved more scrutiny than they received. The confirmed count was 614 enemy dead, 9 prisoners, and hundreds of weapons captured, against 45 Marines killed and 203 wounded, with 5 more Marines later dying of their wounds. On the assumption that the enemy had dragged away many of his dead and that more had been sealed in collapsed caves, an American intelligence report in September raised the estimate to 1,430 killed, a number the official history itself judged probably too high, given that no more than about 1,500 enemy had likely been present at all. The Viet Cong, for their part, told a story that was its own kind of fiction, claiming they had inflicted more than 900 American casualties, destroyed 22 armored vehicles, and downed 13 aircraft while losing only around 200 men. The truth is not recoverable from either set of books. What is beyond dispute is that the 1st Viet Cong Regiment was badly mauled and driven off ground it had held for years. There was also a piece of Starlight the command would have preferred to keep buried, and it concerned the lost supply column. A reporter who would later become very well known covered the ambush in articles that ran under headlines announcing that a Marine supply column had lumbered to death, that painted a picture of untrained crews and incompetence, and that reported relief forces had counted 18 enemy bodies rather than the 60 that Marine witnesses cited. President Johnson personally referred the articles to Marine headquarters, and the military issued a more factual rebuttal. But the episode marked an early fracture in the relationship between the press and the command, one that would widen over the years. The official version and the reported version did not match, and the daylight between them was visible to anyone who cared to look. The lessons the Marines drew ranged from the doctrinal to the almost mundane, which is itself a measure of how new this kind of war still was. At one end, Starlight established that the daily ration of 2 gallons of water per man was simply inadequate in the Vietnamese heat. A finding that sounds trivial until you consider that companies lost men to heat exhaustion, and that the men of Company 1 fought nearly 24 hours on 2 canteens apiece because their resupply column had been ambushed. Poor communications